Take off your clothes." 3 women stood over him in the howling white void. Their voices cut through the wind like broken glass. Gideon Pratt couldn't feel his fingers anymore. He couldn't feel his face. The words made no sense. None of it made sense. He was freezing to death, and they wanted him naked. You heard that right? Naked. In a blizzard that was already killing him. His vision blurred. Snow covered everything, a world of pure, screaming white. The women's faces shifted in and out of focus, their dark eyes watching him with an intensity that felt like a threat, or maybe salvation. He couldn't tell anymore. One of them reached for his coat. He tried to pull away, but his body wouldn't respond. The cold had already won that fight. Through the storm's rage, he caught fragments of their voices, urgent, commanding, speaking in a language he didn't understand, mixed with sharp English words. Strip him, fast. He's already turning. Turning? Turning what? Gideon's mind screamed that this was wrong. Everything he'd ever learned, every story of survival, told him to keep his clothes on, to fight them off, to resist. But his body was shutting down, and the women were already pulling at his frozen jacket with practiced hands. Hands that knew something he didn't. The last coherent thought he had before darkness took him, before the cold and the confusion swallowed him whole, was a simple, terrifying question. Why would taking off his clothes, at 40 below, save his life? 6 hours earlier, Gideon Pratt had been alive enough to feel the cold. The territory stretched before him like an endless sheet of gray sky, pressed flat against frozen earth. His breath came out in thick clouds that hung in the air for seconds before the wind tore them apart. The pack horse behind him snorted nervously, its nostrils flaring white with each exhale. He'd made this supply run a dozen times, cross the open territory, deliver goods to the isolated homesteads scattered across the northern range, and return before the real weather turned. Simple work. Simple work for a man who preferred solitude over conversation. Gideon pulled his coat tighter. The temperature had dropped 10 degrees since morning. His weathered face stung where the wind had exposed it, and his blue-gray eyes watered against the bitter air. At 34, he'd survived enough winters to recognize the signs, the way the clouds pressed down like a closing fist, the particular quality of silence before a storm. He should have turned back 3 miles ago. The thought came too late. The sky opened. What started as scattered flakes became a wall of white within minutes. The wind rose from a whisper to a roar, driving snow horizontally across the plains. Gideon hunched forward in the saddle, one gloved hand gripping the reins while the other pressed his hat down against his skull. His horse, a sturdy mare named Rue, fought against the wind. Her hooves slipped on the ice that was forming beneath the fresh snow. The pack horse behind them panicked, pulling hard on the lead rope, sensing what Gideon was just beginning to understand. This was different. He'd ridden this route in rain, in heat, in autumn winds that could strip bark from trees. But this was a different kind of monster. The temperature was plummeting faster than any storm he'd ever encountered. His beard had already frosted white, ice crystals forming in the hair. His hands, even inside thick leather gloves, were going numb. He couldn't see 20 feet ahead. The world had become nothing but howling wind and stinging snow. Every landmark he knew, the split rock, the line of dead trees, the creek bed, all of it had vanished. He was navigating by instinct now, hoping his sense of direction hadn't failed him. Rue stumbled. The mare's front legs buckled, and Gideon felt her entire body shudder beneath him. He pulled back on the reins, speaking low words of encouragement that the wind stole before they even formed. She tried to rise. She managed 3 steps and went down again. This time, she didn't get up. Gideon dismounted, his boots sinking into snow that was already 8 inches deep and climbing. He checked Rue's legs, felt along her trembling body. No broken bones, but her breathing came in labored gasps, and her eyes showed white with exhaustion and fear. The cold was killing her from the inside out. He knew what it meant. He knew exactly what it meant when a horse went down in weather like this. And that's when it got worse. The pack horse, terrified by the fall, snapped the lead rope. It broke free. Before Gideon could even grab for the rope, the horse vanished into the white chaos. All his supplies, food, blankets, firewood, everything, vanished with it. He was alone, with a dying horse, and temperatures dropping toward deadly. Rue's breathing slowed. Then it stopped. Gideon stood in the screaming wind, feeling the cold work its way through his coat, through his shirt, into his very bones. His clothes, damp with sweat from the exertion of the ride, were freezing against his skin. Each breath burned his lungs. His fingers had lost all sensation. He tried to think, tried to remember the landmarks, calculate how far he was from shelter. But his thoughts moved like cold honey, slow and thick, refusing to flow properly. That's when he saw them. 3 shapes, moving through the storm. They were human-shaped, but wrong somehow. They walked against the wind as if it didn't exist. They came straight toward him, with purpose, with direction, like they'd been looking for him specifically. Gideon's hand moved toward the rifle still in the saddle scabbard. It was an instinct bred from years of stories and warnings, but his fingers wouldn't close around the stock. He couldn't make the grip. The cold had stolen that from him, too. The figures became women. They wore heavy furs that moved with the wind instead of against it. Their faces were weathered, their eyes dark and unreadable. The oldest one stepped forward. She looked at Rue's body, then at Gideon, with an expression he couldn't name. She spoke words he didn't understand. Then, in clear English that cut right through the wind, she said, "You're dying." Gideon tried to respond, but his jaw had locked. His whole body was shaking now, violent tremors he couldn't control. He managed a single word. "Cold." The woman shook her head. "Not cold. Freezing. Different thing." Her eyes scanned him, from his frozen beard to his ice-caked boots. "Your clothes are killing you." The younger women moved closer. One of them gestured at his coat, speaking rapidly in their language. The older woman turned back to Gideon, and what she said next made no sense at all. "Take off your clothes, everything. Do it now, or you die in 4 minutes." Gideon's brain knew this was insane. This was the exact opposite of survival. Everything he'd ever learned, every instinct screamed against it. You don't expose skin in a blizzard. You cover it. But his body was already failing. His vision was darkening at the edges. And somewhere in the growing fog of his dying thoughts, a single, desperate question formed. What if they know something I don't? Gideon's body made the decision his mind couldn't. His legs buckled. The women caught him before he hit the snow. Strong hands gripped his arms, holding him upright as his vision swam. The oldest woman barked orders in her language, and the younger 2 moved with a frightening efficiency. They weren't asking anymore. His coat came off first. Gideon felt the wet, heavy weight of it pulled from his shoulders, and the wind hit him like a physical blow. His body convulsed, shaking so violently his teeth cracked together. He tried to fight. He managed to push weakly at their hands, but his muscles wouldn't obey. "Stop," he tried to say. The word came out as a broken whisper. One of the younger women, barely more than 20, with alert eyes that darted between him and the storm, spoke rapidly as she worked at his shirt buttons. Her fingers moved fast, practiced, ignoring his feeble attempts to stop her. The older woman crouched in front of him, grabbing his face, forcing him to meet her eyes. "Your clothes are wet. Wet cloth steals heat 50 times faster than air. You understand?" Her eyes bored into his. "You wear death right now." Gideon's shirt peeled away from his skin. The fabric had frozen to his chest in places, and removing it felt like tearing off skin. The wind hit his bare torso, and the cold was so intense it burned. His whole body screamed that this was wrong. That exposure meant death. But something in the woman's eyes, An absolute, unshakable certainty held him. They stripped him methodically. Boots, socks, pants, everything came off, until he stood naked in the howling storm, shaking uncontrollably, his skin already turning a deathly blue. The cold was beyond anything he'd ever imagined. It felt alive, predatory, eating into him from every direction. He had seconds, maybe less. The third woman, older than the young one, but younger than the leader, with scars along her forearms and hands that moved with purpose, had already unrolled something from the pack on her back. Thick furs, dry furs, still warm from being carried against her body. They wrapped him like a child, moving fast but careful, covering every inch of his exposed skin. The furs were heavy, layered, and the instant they touched his frozen flesh, he felt the difference. Not warmth, not yet, but the absence of that killing wind, a barrier between him and death. Gideon's consciousness flickered. He felt himself being lifted, carried between two of the women while the third gathered his frozen clothes. Their strength surprised him. They moved through the storm as if they'd walked these plains 1,000 times, their steps sure even as the snow piled higher. His mind drifted. He thought about Rue, dead in the snow, about the supplies scattered somewhere in the white void, about the stories he'd heard his whole life. Warnings about native tribes, about strangers, about trusting anyone who looked different. None of those stories had mentioned this. None had prepared him for the moment when the people he'd been taught to fear became the only thing standing between him and freezing to death. Time lost all meaning. He was aware of movement, of the storm's roar, of hands adjusting the furs around him when the wind tried to tear them away. The shaking had slowed. That should have felt better. It didn't. He knew enough to recognize that stopping the shakes meant his body was giving up the fight. It was running out of energy. Stay. The older woman's voice cut through the fog. Stay here. Stay in your body. Gideon tried to focus on her words, use them as an anchor against the darkness pulling at him. Stay here. Stay in your body. He repeated it in his mind like a prayer, even though prayer had never done much for him before. The storm shifted. The wind, impossibly, grew stronger. Snow came down so thick, it was like walking through walls of white. The women pressed closer together, sheltering him between their bodies, sharing whatever warmth they could. He should have been terrified. He should have been fighting, suspicious, protecting himself. Instead, wrapped in furs that smelled of smoke and hide and something herbal he couldn't name, carried by women whose faces he could barely see. Gideon felt something he hadn't expected. Safe. The thought terrified him more than the cold had. Consciousness slipped away from him in pieces. He caught fragments, a word in their language that sounded like singing. The feeling of being lowered to the ground, something solid at his back instead of wind. Then darkness, and the distant awareness that he was either being saved or dying. And he no longer had the strength to tell which. When awareness returned, everything had changed. He was inside something, not a building. The walls curved wrong, and the wind still howled, but it was muffled now, filtered through barriers he couldn't see. Heat pressed against his left side, not fire heat, body heat. Gideon's eyes cracked open. The world was dim, lit by a pale gray light filtering through gaps he couldn't focus on. His body still shook, but the violent convulsions had eased to tremors he could almost control. One of the women lay pressed against him. Her body was radiating warmth through the layers of fur between them, not skin to skin, but close enough that he could feel the heat transferring, a clinical, life-saving barrier. The young one, he thought, Ayita. He didn't remember learning her name, but somehow, he knew it. The older woman sat nearby, her eyes closed, but her posture alert, awake and resting at the same time. The third woman was doing something with his frozen clothes, hanging them from wooden supports he couldn't quite see in the dim light. Reality crashed back into Gideon's mind with brutal clarity. He was naked under the furs. He was alone with 3 native women he'd met less than an hour ago. Everything he owned was either frozen solid or lost in the storm. He had no horse, no supplies, no weapon within reach. He was completely, utterly dependent on their mercy. And they had saved him. They could have walked past. Any reasonable person would have walked past, letting the storm handle the problem of a lone white man lost in their territory. Why? The question hung in Gideon's mind, unanswered and dangerous. He lay still, listening to the storm rage outside whatever shelter they'd constructed. His body ached in places he didn't know could ache. His fingers and toes burned with the particular agony of flesh, remembering warmth. But he was alive, and the simple fact of that aliveness felt both miraculous and damning. The young woman beside him shifted, adjusting the furs without moving away. Her presence was steady, purposeful, not intimate. Despite the closeness, it was almost clinical, like tending livestock, except with more care than he'd ever shown his own animals. Gideon's throat was raw. He tried to speak, managed only a croak. The older woman's eyes opened immediately. She studied him for a long moment, then reached for something beside her, a water skin. She moved closer, helped him sit up enough to drink without choking. The water was cold, but not frozen. He drank slowly, feeling it trace a burning path down his throat. When he finished, she took the skin back and settled into her previous position, watching him with those dark, unreadable eyes. "Thank you," Gideon said. His voice was barely a whisper, torn raw by the cold and the screaming wind. "You saved my life." The woman nodded once. Yes. No false modesty, no deflection, just a simple acknowledgement of fact. "Why?" The word came out before Gideon could stop it. He immediately regretted asking, but she didn't seem offended. "You were dying," she said, as if that explained everything. "Perhaps, but most people wouldn't stop, wouldn't risk themselves in a storm like this for a stranger." Something that might have been amusement flickered across her weathered face. "Most people don't know how to walk in winter. They fight the wind instead of moving with it. They fight the cold instead of understanding it." Gideon wanted to argue, but his body was living proof that he'd done exactly that. Fought against forces he didn't understand, until those forces nearly killed him. The third woman spoke without looking up from her work with his clothes. Her voice was younger than the leader's, but carried the same certainty. "Your people build walls. Our people learn to walk through, different ways. Neither is wrong, until it kills you." "Takakota speaks truth," the older woman said. "Your wool coat, your cotton shirt, good for your world, but wet cotton steals heat faster than naked skin. You were wearing death, because your people never learned different." The logic was irrefutable, and it shamed him. Not because he'd been wrong, but because he'd been so certain he'd been right, certain enough to die for it. "I'm Kiona," the older woman said, gesturing to herself. Then to the young woman still lying beside him. "My daughter, Aida." Finally to the third woman, "Takakota, my sister." Gideon absorbed this. A family unit, mother, daughter, aunt, not a war party, not raiders, just women who knew how to survive in conditions that had almost killed him. "Gideon," he said. "Gideon Pratt." Kiona nodded, as if his name confirmed something she'd already suspected. "Gideon Pratt, who rides alone through winter territory, carrying supplies to homesteaders who hate him for being kind." His stomach turned cold in a way that had nothing to do with the temperature. How do you know that?" "We watch," Kiona said simply. "We see who travels, who carries what, where they go. You've crossed this territory 12 times in 16 months, always alone, always in winter." She held his gaze. "The homesteaders need food, medicine, flour, They pay you in coins they can barely spare. They need you, but they would not have saved you like we did. The truth of it hit harder than the cold had. The families he'd supplied, the people he'd helped survive these harsh seasons, would any of them have risked this storm to save him? Would any of them have known how? The storm, Gideon said, changing the subject because the other path led to thoughts he wasn't ready to face. How long will it last? 2 days, maybe 3, Kiona said. The worst will pass by tomorrow morning, but the cold will stay, and your horse is dead. Your supplies are scattered. You cannot walk out. The reality of his situation crystallized. He was trapped here, with these women, for days, completely dependent on them for survival. Every instinct he'd developed, every warning he'd absorbed about trusting strangers in isolated places screamed at him that this was dangerous, but those same instincts had nearly killed him an hour ago. Ayita moved away from him finally, rising with a fluid grace. She spoke to her mother in their language, fast, musical words Gideon couldn't follow. Kiona responded, and Takakota joined the conversation. They weren't trying to exclude him. They simply had things to discuss that didn't require his input. Gideon listened to the rhythm of their voices, the easy flow of communication between people who knew each other's thoughts before words formed. He'd never had that, with anyone. He had chosen solitude precisely to avoid the complications of connection. Now, naked under borrowed furs, warmed by the body heat of strangers, trapped in a shelter he couldn't even see properly. Gideon confronted an uncomfortable truth. His solitude hadn't been strength. It had been fear, and fear had nearly killed him just as surely as the cold. The women finished their discussion. Kiona turned back to him. You need to eat. Your body is burning itself to stay warm. If you don't feed it, it will consume you from the inside. Takakota brought something wrapped in cloth. When she unfolded it, Gideon saw dried meat, some kind of pressed cake made from seeds and berries, and something that looked like dried fish. Food from their own supplies. Food they were sharing, when they had no obligation to. He took what she offered, his hands shaking with more than just the cold. I don't know how I'll repay this. Kiona's expression didn't change. You won't. You can't. Some debts cannot be balanced with coins or trade. The words should have felt threatening. Instead, they felt oddly freeing. Gideon ate slowly, forcing his reluctant stomach to accept nourishment. The food was strange, flavors he didn't recognize, textures his tongue couldn't quite place. But it was good. Better than good. It was sustenance, offered freely, and that made it taste like grace. Outside, the storm howled with renewed fury. Inside the small shelter, warmth slowly seeped back into Gideon's bones. And with that warmth came the terrifying realization that everything he'd believed about himself, about survival, about who could be trusted, had been wrong. The question was, what would he do with that knowledge when the storm passed? Night came, though Gideon only knew because Kiona said so. Inside the shelter, the darkness was absolute. There was no fire. Kiona had explained that smoke would fill the small, snow-packed space and kill them faster than the cold ever could. Instead, they relied on body heat, layered furs, and the insulation of packed snow around the structure's base. Gideon lay in the darkness, listening to the storm's fury and the steady, quiet breathing of the 3 women. His body had stopped shaking hours ago, warmth finally returning to his core. But with physical comfort came mental discomfort, thoughts he'd kept buried under layers of certainty and isolation. You're thinking loud, Ayita said from somewhere to his left. Her English was clearer than her mother's, with less of an accent. I can hear it from here. Despite himself, Gideon almost smiled. Didn't know thoughts had sound. Everything has sound if you listen right, she said. She shifted in the darkness. You want to ask something. Ask. Gideon hesitated. The question had been building since he woke, growing heavier with each hour. Why were you out in the storm? Nobody travels in weather like that. Not unless they have no choice. A silence stretched, long enough that he thought she wouldn't answer. Then she did. We were tracking the herd, elk. They moved south early this year. Means a harder winter than usual. We needed to mark where they went, so when the snow clears, we know where to hunt. In that storm? The storm came fast, faster than we expected, she said. Her voice held no defensiveness, just fact. We were looking for shelter when we found you. Or maybe you found us. Hard to say who found who when nobody can see. Lucky, Gideon said. Maybe. Kiona's voice came from the opposite side of the shelter. Or maybe the land puts people where they need to be. You don't believe that, though. You believe in chance and accident. He did. He had always believed that. Random events, meaningless chaos, survival of the prepared or the lucky. But lying here, alive, because 3 strangers had appeared exactly when and where he needed them. That belief felt less solid. My father believed in signs, Gideon heard himself say, words he hadn't spoken in years. He saw meaning in everything. A bird flying left meant one thing, right meant another. He paused, the memory still sharp. He died waiting for a sign to tell him it was safe to cross a river, drowned, because he believed the world was talking to him instead of just being what it was. So you decided to believe in nothing, Kiona said. It wasn't a question. I decided to believe in what I could see, touch, prove. And now? Takakota spoke for the first time in hours. Her voice was quiet, but it pierced the darkness. You can see we are here. You can touch the furs that warm you. You can prove you are alive. Do you believe now? The question cut deeper than Gideon expected. I don't know, he whispered. I don't know what I believe anymore. Good, Kiona said. Certainty makes men stupid. Doubt makes them wise. Ayita laughed softly. My mother collects sayings like some women collect beads. She has one for everything. Because everything has been lived before, Kiona replied, her voice firm. Only the names and faces change. The struggles stay the same. Gideon shifted under the furs. His body was still tender, but it was functional. How did you know? About the wet clothes? About how to save someone from freezing? My grandmother taught my mother. My mother taught me. Her grandmother taught her, Kiona said. Her voice carried the weight of generations. Knowledge passes down like blood. Your people write things in books. We write them in children. We lose fewer that way. Takakota added, books burn. Children remember. It made sense in a way that formal education never had. Gideon had attended school for 6 years. He'd learned reading and arithmetic and history that felt disconnected from the act of living. But these women, they carried survival in their bones, taught through experience and necessity. The clothes, he said, still trying to grasp it. I still don't understand how being naked is warmer. Not warmer, Kiona corrected him patiently. Less cold. Your wet clothes pulled heat from your body into the water in the fabric. Water takes heat and holds it away from you. When we removed the wet, we stopped the stealing. The furs, they trap air. Air warmed by your body. Air is a better keeper of heat than water. Simple, logical, and completely contrary to everything his instincts had screamed. How many people, Gideon asked carefully, have you saved this way? Silence again. Longer this time. 3, Ayita finally said. Before you. 2 survived. 1 we found too late. The weight of that settled over Gideon. They had tried this before. They had succeeded twice, and failed once. They had known the risk of stripping him in that storm. They had known it might not work, and they had done it anyway. The one who didn't make it, Gideon said, his throat tight. Was he? Was he white? Yes. Kiona's voice was flat, devoid of emotion. A young man, maybe 20 winters, a trapper. We found him half frozen, just like you. We tried to save him. She paused. He fought us. He thought we meant to kill him. He kept fighting, until he died fighting. The implication hung heavy in the cold, dark air. That man had died. He had died because he couldn't trust. Because everything he'd been taught told him that these women were dangerous. Gideon had almost made the same choice. His own fear had almost been his executioner. I'm sorry, he said, and he meant it. Don't be sorry for him, Kiona said, her voice hard. Be smarter than him. Fear is useful. It keeps you alive when threats are real, but fear of the wrong things, that kills you, just as dead. Thunder cracked outside, a rare sound in a winter storm, but unmistakable. The shelter shuddered. Snow cascaded down the outer walls. Gideon tensed, suddenly, terribly aware of how fragile their protection was. Just bent branches and packed snow between them and a lethal cold. It will hold, Aida said, her voice calm, reading his fear in the darkness. We've built 100 shelters like this, maybe more. They hold. How long have you been doing this? Traveling, tracking, surviving out here? Since I could walk, she said. My mother's been doing it since before I was born. Takakota, longer than that. This is our land. We don't visit it. We live it. The distinction seemed important, though Gideon couldn't articulate why. He thought about his cabin, his supply routes, the way he moved through the territory as if crossing a stage, passing through, but never being a part of it. Sleep now, Kiona said, her voice softening just a little. Tomorrow the storm will ease. You'll need strength. For what? Gideon asked. For choosing who you want to be. When you leave here. The words settled over Gideon like another layer of furs, heavy, warming, and impossible to ignore. Outside, the storm raged on. Inside, in the darkness and the warmth and the unexpected safety, Gideon closed his eyes and tried to imagine what kind of man he might choose to become. Morning light filtered through gaps in the shelter's construction. Gray and weak, but it was present. Gideon woke to find Aida already awake, checking the entrance. She glanced back when she heard him stir. Storm is breaking, she said. Still dangerous, but less angry. His body protested every movement as he sat up. Muscles, stiff from cold and inactivity, screamed. The furs fell away from his chest, and he realized with a sudden, hot embarrassment that he was still naked beneath them. His clothes hung from the support poles, no longer frozen solid, but still far too damp to wear. Kiona noticed his discomfort and spoke without looking at him. Modesty is a luxury. Out here, staying alive matters more than shame. Your clothes need another day to dry properly. Gideon wrapped the furs tighter around himself, accepting the truth even as it chafed against his raising. Another day, Takakota confirmed. She was doing something with small pieces of leather and what looked like bone needles. Maybe 2 if the cold holds. Your boots. They took the most water. Leather holds moisture deep. If you put them on wet, you lose toes. The casual mention of amputation sobered him instantly. What do I do until then? You stay here, you rest, you let your body finish healing, Kiona said. She moved to the entrance, peering out at the diminishing storm. The hard cold did damage you can't see yet, pushed too soon, and what should heal will break instead. Gideon wanted to argue. He wanted to insist he was fine, that he could manage, but his hands still ached with a deep bone cold, and his feet felt distant and foreign. His body was telling him what his pride didn't want to hear. I'm not used to being helpless, he admitted. Nobody is, Aida said. She had returned to the shelter with a pack full of clean snow. But everybody needs help sometimes. The difference is whether you fight it. or accept it. She began melting the snow in her mouth, spitting the water into a bladder. The process was painstakingly slow. Snow took enormous body heat to melt. But it was the only way to create drinking water without a fire. Gideon watched, fascinated by the efficiency of it. Every action these women took served multiple purposes. Nothing wasted, nothing careless. Survival, distilled to its purest form. "Can I help?" he asked. All three women looked at him. Their expressions were ones he couldn't quite read. Finally, Kiona nodded. "You can prepare cordage. We'll need it to carry your dried clothes when we move." She handed him plant fibers, some kind of dried grass or reed, and showed him how to twist and braid them into rope. His cold, stiffened fingers fumbled at first, but the repetitive motion gradually brought feeling back. The work was meditative. It required attention, but not thought. As they worked in a companionable silence, Gideon found himself studying his unlikely saviors. Kiona's hands bore the scars of a lifetime of hard work. Old burns, cuts that had healed crooked, calluses in places that spoke to specific tasks repeated endlessly. Takakota's fingers moved with the precision of someone who'd spent decades working with leather and sinew. Ayita's movements held the controlled energy of youth, but her eyes showed the weariness of someone who'd seen enough to know the world could turn dangerous without warning. They were competent in ways that made his own skills seem shallow. He knew horses. He knew supply routes. He knew how to read weather. Or at least, he thought he had. But these women, they knew survival at a level he'd never even approached. "Why do you live out here?" The question emerged before he thought better of it. Wouldn't it be easier, closer to the settlements? The women exchanged glances. Takakota spoke first. "Easier, yes. But easier for who?" Kiona set down the tool she'd been using to scrape a piece of hide. "Your settlements. They don't want us. Not unless we pretend to be what we're not. Dress like you. Speak only your language. Forget our own ways. And even then," she said, her voice flat, "we are tolerated, not welcomed." "So, we choose this," Ayita said. She gestured at the shelter, at the howling wind outside, at the harsh simplicity of their existence. "Hard land, but it's an honest land. It doesn't lie about what it is, or what it wants from us." Gideon felt shame burn through him, hot and uncomfortable. He'd never thought about it from that perspective. He had never questioned why native families lived in isolated camps instead of in the towns. He had assumed it was choice, preference, maybe stubbornness, not a necessity, born from rejection. "I didn't know," he said, knowing how inadequate the words were. "Most don't," Kiona replied without bitterness. "It's easier not to see what makes you uncomfortable." The accusation stung, precisely because it was true. Gideon had chosen isolation partly to avoid this, to avoid the messy reality of other people's lives. He'd told himself it was independence. Looking at these women, he realized it was cowardice. The wind outside shifted, and with it came a sound that made all three women freeze. Gideon heard it too, a low rumble, rhythmic, and growing louder. "What is that?" "Riders," Kiona said. Her voice was suddenly tense, sharp. "Multiple horses, coming this direction." Takakota moved to the entrance with fluid speed, looking out through a tiny gap. Her expression darkened. 5 men, armed, moving slow but purposeful. Gideon's stomach dropped. "Looking for something." "Looking for someone," Kiona corrected. Her eyes found his. "You've been missing for 2 days. People will search. The question is, whether they're searching to help or searching to blame." The implication hit him like a bucket of cold water. 5 armed men, moving through a breaking storm, looking for a missing white man. If they found him here, naked, sheltering with 3 native women, his clothes hanging up to dry, there was no scenario where this ended well. "You need to hide," Ayita said urgently. She was already moving, trying to conceal the evidence of his presence. "If they find you here, they'll assume the worst," Gideon finished. "They'll think you attacked me, stripped me, that I'm a prisoner." "Or worse," Takakota said quietly. "They'll think we killed you and are keeping the body." The riders were closer now. Voices carried on the wind, rough, masculine, aggressive in their certainty. Gideon looked at the three women, the women who had saved his life, who had risked themselves in the storm, who had shared their food and their warmth and their knowledge, and he made a choice that would define everything that came after. "No," he said, "I'm not hiding." Kiona's eyes widened just slightly. "You understand what you're risking?" "I understand what you risked for me." Gideon pulled the furs tighter around himself, preparing for the inevitable. "Time I returned the favor." Outside, the voices grew louder, and Gideon braced himself for the moment when two worlds would collide. The horses stopped right outside the shelter. Gideon heard boots hitting the frozen ground, the creak of leather, the metallic, unmistakable click of rifles being readied. His heart hammered against his ribs. The furs around him suddenly felt less like protection and more like evidence of something that could be twisted into an accusation. "Gideon Pratt!" The voice was one he recognized. Walter Drummond, the homesteader from the northern ridge. "If you're in there, make yourself known." Gideon stood, steadying himself on legs that still felt uncertain. The movement sent pain shooting through his cold, damaged feet. "I'm here, Walter. I'm alive." Silence. Then boots, approaching fast, crunching through the snow. "Stand back," Kiona said quietly to her daughter and sister. "Let them see everything at once. No surprises." The entrance covering was torn aside. 5 men crowded into the opening, rifles raised. Their eyes, adjusting to the dim interior, took in the scene. Gideon, wrapped in furs, visibly alive, but obviously naked beneath them. 3 native women standing calmly just a few feet away. His clothes hanging up to dry, no weapons visible, no signs of a struggle. Walter's rifle lowered slightly. Confusion was replacing the aggressive certainty he'd entered with. "What in the name of... Gideon? What happened to you?" "I nearly froze to death," Gideon said. He kept his voice steady. "My horse died in the storm. These women found me. They stripped off my wet clothes. And they saved my life. If they hadn't, you'd be looking at a corpse right now." Another man, younger and more aggressive, kept his rifle trained on Kiona. "Stripped you? Why the hell would they?" "Because wet clothes steal heat 50 times faster than air?" Gideon interrupted. His voice was sharp. "Because I was dying of hypothermia, and removing the wet fabric was the only way to stop my body from losing more warmth. They knew that. I didn't." "That's convenient," the young man, Marcus, said. "A real convenient story." Walter shot him a warning look. "Hold your tongue, Marcus." He turned back to Gideon. "You're saying they... rescued you? Voluntary-like?" "I'm saying they saved me when they could have walked past. When any reasonable person would have kept moving to save themselves." Gideon met Walter's eyes. "I'm saying I'd be dead without them. And if anyone suggests otherwise, they're calling me a liar." The weight of that statement settled over the cramped space. Calling Gideon Pratt a liar. That meant calling into question the word of the man who'd supplied their families through hard winters. The man who'd never cheated them. The man who'd proven his reliability a dozen times over. A third man, older than the others, with gray threading through his beard, lowered his rifle completely. "Your horse. We found her. Or what the storm left of her. Been tracking your route since the weather broke, figuring you'd either be dead or holed up somewhere." "Found your supplies, too," another added. "Scattered across half a mile. Pack horse must have spooked and run." Gideon nodded. "That's about right. I went down when Rue died. Would have died right beside her if these women hadn't appeared. Marcus still hadn't lowered his weapon. And you expect us to believe they just happened to be out in that storm? That they just happened to find you? I expect you to believe what I'm telling you, Gideon said, his voice hardening. Or we can have a different conversation about respect and trust. Kiona spoke for the first time since the men entered. Her voice was calm. We were tracking an elk herd. The storm came fast. We sought shelter. We found him instead. Your friend was turning blue when we found him, minutes from death. And you just helped him? Out of the goodness of your hearts? Marcus's skepticism dripped like poison. Yes, Kiona said simply. She locked eyes with him. Is that difficult for you to understand? That someone might help a stranger? The question hung in the air. It exposed the ugly assumption beneath Marcus's hostility, that these women must have had an ulterior motive. That kindness wasn't possible from people who looked different. Walter seemed to sense the dangerous ground they were treading. Marcus, lower your damn rifle. Gideon's alive. He ain't hurt. And these women clearly saved his life. Walter's eyes swept the room. That's the end of it. He repeated it, his tone leaving no room for argument. End of it. Marcus lowered his weapon, slowly. His jaw was tight with frustration. The other men followed suit, though their eyes continued scanning the shelter with obvious discomfort. Your clothes still wet? The gray-bearded man asked. Too wet to wear safely? Yes, Gideon confirmed. Another day at least, before they're dry enough. Walter considered this. We brought supplies, extra blankets, some food. Figured you might need 'em. He paused. Didn't expect to find you like this, though. Neither did I, Gideon said. But I'm grateful for it. Grateful to be alive. And grateful to these women for knowing what I didn't. The men shifted uncomfortably. They were unsure how to process the situation. Their rescue mission had found its target alive and well, saved by the very people many of them had been taught to distrust. The contradiction didn't fit their understanding of how the world worked. We should head back, one of the men said. Let folks know Gideon's alive. They've been worried. Walter nodded, but his eyes stayed on Gideon. You coming with us, or you need more time? Gideon looked at his still damp boots. He looked at the women who had saved him, at the shelter that had become something more than just a refuge from the cold. I need another day, maybe 2. My feet aren't ready for the walk yet. We can bring a horse, Walter offered. I'll walk, Gideon said firmly. When I'm ready, not before. An understanding passed between them. Gideon was choosing to stay, not because he had to, but because he wanted to. That choice said more than any explanation could. Walter nodded slowly. All right, we'll check back in 2 days. If you're not back by then, we'll come looking again. Fair enough. The men filed out, their departure marked by uncomfortable silence and backward glances. Only Walter lingered at the entrance. Gideon, you sure about this? Gideon met his eyes steadily. Surer than I've been about anything in a long time. Walter absorbed this. Then he nodded once and left. The shelter felt larger with just the 4 of them again. Gideon became aware of how tightly he'd been holding himself, how much tension had coiled in his shoulders. That could have gone worse, Aita said quietly. Could have gone better too, Takakota added. Kiona said nothing, but her eyes held something that might have been respect, or maybe just acknowledgement. Acknowledgement that Gideon had chosen correctly, when the choice mattered most. Outside, the horses retreated, their hoofbeats fading into the vast, white silence. And Gideon knew that when he finally walked back to civilization, nothing would be the same. The shelter felt different after the men left. Not physically. It was the same cramped space, the same filtered gray light, the same wind howling outside. But something had shifted in the air between Gideon and the three women. An invisible barrier had fallen. Or maybe it had just built itself stronger. He couldn't tell which. Kiona settled back into her position, returning to the hide she'd been working before the interruption. Her hands moved with a steady, practiced precision. But Gideon noticed a tension in her shoulders that hadn't been there before. "They'll talk," she said, without looking up. "When they get back, they'll tell stories about what they saw." "Let them talk," Gideon replied. "I told the truth." "Truth doesn't stop stories," Kiona said. "Sometimes it makes them worse." Takakota checked his boots, pressing her thumb into the leather to test the moisture levels. Still too wet. Another day. Minimum. Aida sat near the entrance, watching the gray sky beyond. "The young one. Marcus. He didn't believe you. Not really." "I know. He'll cause trouble." "Probably." Aida turned to look at him, her expression serious beyond her years. "You understand what you did back there? You tied yourself to us. In their eyes. You chose a side." "I chose honesty," Gideon said. "Same thing to them." The weight of it settled on him. She was right. By defending these women, by insisting on the truth of his rescue, by refusing to let their suspicion poison what happened, he had aligned himself, and that alignment would have consequences. Some of the homesteaders like Walter would understand. They would accept his word because they'd known him long enough to trust it. But others like Marcus, they would see betrayal. They would question his judgment, his loyalty, maybe even his sanity. "You could change your story," Kiona said quietly. "When you get back, say we forced you to defend us, that you were still recovering, not thinking clearly. They'd believe that. It would be easier. For you." Gideon met her eyes. "Is that what you want me to do?" "It doesn't matter what I want," she said. "It matters what's true, and what you can live with." He thought about his father, drowning in a river because he'd waited for a sign that never came. He thought about spending his life isolated, because connection meant complexity. He thought about nearly dying in the snow, because his certainty had been stronger than his wisdom. "I'm done with easy lies," he said. "I'm done pretending the world is simpler than it is." Kiona held his gaze for a long moment. Then she nodded once. "Good. Lying to yourself is slower than freezing, but it kills you just as dead." The day passed in quiet industry. Gideon worked on the cordage, his fingers growing more nimble as circulation fully returned. Takakota continued with her leather work, repairing their gear. Aida tended to small tasks, checking their supplies, monitoring the weather. They worked in a comfortable silence, the kind that comes from people who don't need words to communicate purpose. Gideon found himself falling into their rhythm naturally, his movements synchronizing with theirs without conscious thought. As the afternoon faded toward evening, Aida broke the silence. "When you go back, what will you do?" "What I've always done," Gideon said. "Make supply runs, help people survive the winter." "And when they question you? When they ask why you trust us?" He considered the question carefully. "I'll tell them you saved my life. I'll tell them you knew things I didn't. And I'll tell them that my ignorance almost killed me, and your wisdom kept me alive." "Some won't want to hear that," Takakota said. "Then they don't have to listen," Gideon replied. "But I won't lie to make them comfortable." Kiona actually smiled. The expression transformed her weathered face, just for a second. "You're learning, slowly, but you're learning." "What am I learning?" "That comfort and truth don't always walk the same path," she said, "and that sometimes you have to choose which one matters more." Night approached again, Gideon's third in the shelter, his last if the weather held and his boots dried properly. Tomorrow he'd leave this small space and return to his larger world. A world he no longer fit into, carrying knowledge that would complicate everything. "Can I ask something?" he said, as darkness gathered. "Something that might offend." "Ask," Kiona said. "We'll tell you if it offends." "Why? Why help me at all? You knew what risk it carried. You knew that even if I survived, there'd be questions, suspicions, like Marcus. Why not just keep walking?" The women exchanged glances in the dim light. Finally, Aida spoke. Her voice was soft. "My mother's mother. She saved a white man once, a long time ago. He'd fallen through ice, was drowning in the freezing water. She pulled him out, warmed him, saved his life." "What happened to him?" Gideon asked. "He went back to his people," Aida said, "and he told the truth about how she'd saved him." She paused, and her voice softened even more. 2 months later, soldiers came. They were looking for troublemakers, people to relocate. The man. He stood between my great-grandmother and the soldiers. He told them she was under his protection, that anyone who touched her would have to answer to him. "Did it work?" Gideon whispered. "She lived free until she died of old age," Aida said, "because one man chose to honor a debt, instead of forget it." The story hung in the cold air between them. Gideon understood. He understood everything. They had saved him, yes, because it was the right thing to do, but they had also saved him, partly as a test, to see if he would be the man who fought them and died, or if he would be the man who honored the debt. "I won't forget," he said quietly. "I won't forget what you did, what you taught me, what you risked." "Words are cheap," Takakota said, her voice a low rumble. "Actions cost. We'll see what yours are worth." Outside, the storm had finally died completely. Stars emerged through the breaking clouds, cold and distant and indifferent. Tomorrow he'd walk back toward civilization, carrying truths that would complicate everything. The question was whether he'd have the courage to live by them. Morning came clear and brutally cold. Gideon dressed slowly. His body was still tender, but it was functional. The clothes were completely dry now, stiff from freezing and thawing, but they felt warm against his skin. His boots fit tighter than before. His feet were still swollen from the cold damage, but they would carry him home. Kiona watched him prepare, her expression unreadable. "Your feet will hurt. For weeks, maybe months. The cold goes deeper than skin." "I know." Gideon laced his boots carefully, feeling every protest from the damaged tissue. It's a small price for being alive. Takakota handed him a small bundle wrapped in leather. Food for the walk, and medicine, herbs. Chew them if the pain gets too bad. He accepted the bundle. He knew it came from their limited supplies. He knew they were giving him something they might need themselves. "I can't repay this." "We told you before," Aida said, a small smile on her face. "Some debts don't balance. You just carry them forward." They emerged from the shelter together, into a world of blinding sunlight reflecting off endless white. The world had been scrubbed clean by the storm, transformed into something alien and beautiful and deadly. Gideon's eyes watered against the brightness. His path lay south and east, following landmarks he now knew by heart. The women would travel west, continuing their tracking of the elk herd. Their paths diverged here. They likely wouldn't cross again for months, maybe years, maybe never. "If you need supplies," Gideon said. The words felt awkward, but necessary. "Food, medicine, anything. You know where I live. You're welcome there." Kiona nodded slowly. "We know, but understand. If we come, others will see. They will question. Your words today will be tested by your actions tomorrow." "Let them question," Gideon said. "I know what I know now." He started walking. Each step sent a jolt of pain up through his feet, into his legs. After 20 yards, he looked back. The 3 women stood watching him, dark shapes against the white snow. Aita raised one hand in farewell. Gideon returned the gesture. Then he turned south, toward home. The walk took 6 hours. It should have taken 3. His damaged feet forced him to stop frequently, and the deep snow made every step an effort. But the sky stayed clear, and the cold, while bitter, was no longer lethal. He thought about what awaited him. Questions, certainly. Suspicion from some. But also the simple reality that he was alive, and they had all expected him to be dead. That would have to count for something. The first homestead appeared on the horizon as the sun began its descent. Smoke rose from the chimney, a marker of civilization and warmth, and the complicated world of people and their judgments. Walter was there when Gideon arrived, along with several others. They'd been watching for him. Their faces showed relief, mixed with curiosity, and in Marcus's case, barely concealed hostility. "You made it," Walter said, stating the obvious, because someone had to break the silence. "I did," Gideon said. He stood before them, tired and hurting, but unbowed. "Thanks to 3 women who knew more about survival than I did." Marcus stepped forward. "Been thinking about that, about you. Staying, extra days, with them. Folks are wondering." "Then folks can ask me directly," Gideon interrupted, his voice hard. "And I'll tell them the same thing I'm telling you. I was dying. They saved me. I stayed because my boots were too wet to wear safely, and I wasn't fool enough to risk losing my feet after surviving everything else." "Convenient excuse," Marcus muttered. Gideon turned to face him fully. "You calling me a liar, Marcus? Because if you are, say it plain. Don't hide behind muttering." The challenge hung in the cold air. Marcus's hand moved toward his hip, then stopped. He wasn't quite angry enough, or stupid enough, to draw on the one man the entire community relied on. "Didn't say that," Marcus said finally, backing down. "Good." Gideon turned to Walter. "I need to resupply. My horse is dead. My pack is scattered. Need a new mount, and gear to replace what the storm took." "We can arrange that," Walter said. "Take a few days, but we'll get you sorted." "Appreciated." Gideon pulled the bundle Takakota had given him from his coat. "And I need you to do something else." The men watched him. "Those women, the ones who saved me, if they come here, if they need supplies, they get them. On my account. No questions. No trouble." The statement landed like a stone in water. Ripples spread through the assembled men. This was more than just defending them in the moment. This was an ongoing commitment. Public. Binding. Walter absorbed this. That's asking a lot, Gideon." "They gave me my life, Walter. I'm giving them access to food and medicine. Seems fair to me." Several of the men shifted uncomfortably, but Walter, after a long pause, nodded. "Your account, your choice. I'll spread the word." Marcus made a disgusted sound and stalked away. 2 others followed him, but the rest stayed, and their staying mattered more than the leaving. Gideon spent the next hour answering questions, telling the story again and again and again. Each time, he told the same truth: how the wet clothes had been killing him, how the women had known to remove them, how their knowledge had saved his life. Some listeners nodded, understanding. Others remained skeptical. He accepted both responses with an equal calm. As night fell, he returned to his cabin, small, cold, and empty of everything except basic furniture and supplies. It had been his refuge for years. Now it felt less like freedom and more like hiding. He built a fire, made simple food, and tended to his damaged feet. The physical recovery would take time. But the other changes, the ones written in decisions and commitments and truth spoken despite the consequences, those were already permanent. Gideon Pratt had walked into a storm alone. He had come back connected to the people who'd saved him. He had faced a choice between a comfortable lie and a complicated truth. He had chosen the truth, and he would live with whatever that choice caused. Outside, the snow began to fall again, gentle this time, not the killing fury of before. Inside, warming slowly by his fire, Gideon understood something he hadn't before. Survival wasn't about being strong enough to face everything alone. It was about being wise enough to accept help from those who knew things you didn't, and brave enough to honor that help when honor became difficult. He'd learned that lesson at 40 below, naked under borrowed furs, saved by 3 women who had appeared in the storm like an answer to a question he hadn't even known to ask. And he'd carry that lesson for whatever years remained to him. If you enjoyed this story, click the video on your screen now to watch another tale from the untamed frontier, where survival and dignity meet in unexpected ways. Don't forget to subscribe and consider leaving a super chat to help us keep bringing you stories that challenge what you think you know. Your support makes all the difference.